The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of cameras and the occasional shuffle of papers. Keanu Reeves sat in a plush chair, his posture relaxed but attentive. The soft glow of studio lights illuminated his face, casting gentle shadows that highlighted his thoughtful expression. Across from him, a seasoned interviewer leaned forward, her pen poised over a notepad. The atmosphere was calm, almost intimate, as if the world outside had momentarily faded away. This wasn't just another interview, it was something more, an opportunity to explore a topic that had captured global attention. Pope Robert Prevost, Keanu. Reeves wasn't someone who often spoke about religion or faith. Known for his humility and introspective nature, he usually preferred to let his work do the talking. But tonight was different. Tonight, he had agreed to share his thoughts on a man who had recently become the center of worldwide fascination. Pope Robert Prevost, the newly elected leader of the Catholic Church, had made headlines not just for his unexpected rise to power, but for his unconventional approach to leadership. From the moment he stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, Prevost had signaled a new era, one marked by compassion, inclusivity, and a bold willingness to challenge long-standing traditions. As the interviewer began with a warm smile, she asked a simple question. "Keanu, what are your thoughts on faith and spirituality?" Reeves paused for a moment, his dark eyes reflecting deep consideration. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a calm authority that immediately drew the audience in. "Faith," he said slowly, choosing each word with care, "is like hope made tangible. It's believing in something greater than ourselves." His tone was measured, yet there was an undeniable sincerity in his words. It was clear that this wasn't just a rehearsed answer. It was a belief he had spent time reflecting on. He continued, explaining how faith didn't have to be tied to any specific religion or doctrine. "It's about connection," he said, leaning slightly forward. "Connection to others, to the world around us, and maybe even to something we can't fully understand." His explanation resonated deeply with those watching, whether they were religious or not. There was something universal about the way he described faith, not as a rigid set of rules, but as a bridge between people and their shared humanity. The conversation then shifted to Pope Robert Prevost himself. The interviewer noted how the pontiff had quickly become a figure of intrigue, both within the Catholic Church and beyond. She asked Reeves if he had been following the news surrounding Prevost's election and early actions as pope. Reeves nodded, his expression softening. "Yes, I've been paying attention," he admitted. "There's something refreshing about him. He speaks like someone who truly listens." This observation struck a chord. Many viewers had noticed the same thing. About Pope Prevost. Unlike some of his predecessors who often seemed distant or formal, Prevost exuded warmth and accessibility. In his first public addresses, he had spoken directly to the struggles of ordinary people, those grappling with poverty, loneliness, and division. He hadn't shied away from addressing controversial topics either, calling for unity in a time of growing polarization. It was this authenticity that had endeared him to so many, including Reeves. Reeves went on to describe a particular moment that had stood out to him. During one of Prevost's early sermons, the Pope had urged Catholics, and indeed all people, to focus less on judgment and more on compassion. "He said something that really stuck with me," Reeves recalled. "He talked about seeing everyone as a child of God regardless of their background or beliefs." As he recounted these words, his voice took on a reflective tone. "In a world where it feels like we're constantly being divided, that message is incredibly powerful." The audience listened intently, hanging on every word. Reeves's ability to articulate complex ideas in such a relatable way was part of what made him so compelling. He wasn't lecturing or preaching, he was simply sharing his perspective, inviting others to consider it alongside their own. And while some might have expected him to stick to safe, neutral topics, Reeves showed no hesitation in diving deeper. He spoke openly about how Prevost's approach reminded him of the importance of empathy, not just in leadership, but in everyday life. At one point, the interviewer asked if Reeves saw any parallels between himself and the new pope. It was a question that could have easily caught him off guard, but instead, he responded with characteristic humility. "I don't compare myself to him at all," he said with a small laugh. "But I do think we share a desire to connect with people on a human level." He explained how, throughout his career, he had always valued authenticity over fame. Whether through his roles on screen or his interactions off-screen, he had consistently sought to create meaningful connections. In a way, this aligned with Prevost's mission, to remind people of their shared humanity and the importance of treating one another with kindness. As the segment neared its end, the interviewer thanked Reeves for his insights, noting how rare it was to hear such candid reflections from a public figure. But even as she moved on to the next question, it was clear that the impact of his words would linger. Viewers around the world found themselves reflecting on what they had just heard. For some, it sparked a renewed interest in faith and spirituality. For others, it reinforced the value of compassion and understanding in an increasingly fragmented world. By the time the cameras cut to a commercial break, social media was already buzzing. Clips of Reeves' responses began circulating online, accompanied by comments praising his wisdom and sincerity. People marveled at how effortlessly he had connected with the topic, turning what could have been a routine interview into something far more profound. Little did anyone know this was only the beginning. Over the course of the evening, Reeves would delve even deeper into the subject, offering insights that would leave a lasting impression on millions. What made this moment particularly special was the way it transcended boundaries. Regardless of religious affiliation or lack thereof, viewers felt a sense of resonance with Reeves's words. They weren't just listening to an actor discuss a pope. They were hearing a fellow human being share his thoughts on hope, connection, and the enduring power of compassion. And as the interview progressed, it became increasingly clear that this was a conversation worth having, one that would inspire reflection and dialogue long after the cameras stopped rolling. As the interview moved into its second segment, the conversation deepened. The host leaned in slightly, her curiosity evident as she asked Keanu Reeves to elaborate on what specifically drew him to Pope Robert Prevost. "You mentioned earlier that there's something refreshing about him," she said, her tone inviting. "Can you tell us more about that?" Reeves paused for a moment, his brow furrowing as if he were carefully collecting his thoughts. Then with a small nod, he began to speak. "It's not just one thing," he said, his voice steady and calm. "It's the way he carries himself, his humility, his openness. He doesn't come across as someone trying to impress or dominate. Instead, he seems genuinely interested in understanding people." He went on to describe how Prevost had already made waves with his actions since becoming pope. One of the most striking examples was the pontiff's decision to visit a refugee camp shortly after his election. While such visits weren't unheard of, the manner in which Prevost conducted himself left a lasting impression. Rather than delivering a formal speech or keeping a safe distance, he had walked among the refugees, sitting with them, listening to their stories, and even sharing meals. It was this kind of hands-on approach that resonated deeply with Reeves. He didn't just show up to be seen, Reeves explained. He showed up to be present. That's rare, especially for someone in his position. His words carried weight, and the audience could feel it. There was no grandstanding here, just an honest admiration for a leader who prioritized human connection over appearances. The interviewer nodded thoughtfully, then asked another question. "Do you think this approach is something the world needs right now?" Reeves didn't hesitate. "Absolutely," he replied, his tone firm but gentle. "We're living in a time when so many people feel disconnected, not just from each other, but from themselves. Technology has brought us closer in some ways, but it's also created barriers. We scroll through our phones instead of looking into someone's eyes. We judge before we listen." His observation struck a chord with viewers. In an age dominated by social media and instant communication, many people felt unseen and unheard. Reeves's description of Prevost's methods offered a stark contrast, a reminder of the power of genuine interaction. "What I admire about Pope Robert," he continued, "is that he's not afraid to slow down. He takes the time to really see people to acknowledge their pain and their struggles. And that matters. It makes them feel valued. The conversation shifted again as the host brought up one of Prevost's boldest moves, his call for unity among divided nations. Just weeks into his papacy, the Pope had issued a statement urging world leaders to set aside their differences and work together for the common good. It was a message that transcended politics, touching on themes of cooperation and mutual respect. Reeves admitted he had been particularly moved by this gesture. "There's a lot of fear in the world today," he said, his expression thoughtful. "Fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear of each other. And when you're afraid, it's easy to turn inward, to focus only on protecting yourself or your group. But Pope Robert is saying, no, we need to look outward. We need to build bridges, not walls." He paused, letting the words sink in. That's not an easy thing to say, especially in times like these. But it's exactly what we need to hear. The audience listened intently, captivated by the sincerity in Reeves's voice. He wasn't speaking as an authority on religion or politics, he was simply sharing his perspective as a fellow human being. And perhaps that was why his words carried such weight. They came from a place of authenticity, free of pretense or agenda. At one point, the interviewer asked Reeves if he thought Prevost's message of unity was realistic. After all, the world was rife with conflict, and achieving true harmony seemed like an impossible task. Reeves smiled faintly, his eyes softening. "Realistic? Maybe not immediately," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean it's not worth striving for. Change always starts small, with individuals choosing to act differently, to think differently. If enough people embrace that mindset, it can spread." He pointed to history as an example, citing moments when seemingly insurmountable divisions had been bridged through acts of courage and compassion. "Look at civil rights movements or peace treaties between warring nations," he said. "Those didn't happen overnight. They happened because people refused to give up hope. They kept pushing forward, even when it felt hopeless." The analogy resonated with viewers, many of whom found themselves nodding along. Reeves's optimism was infectious, offering a glimmer of hope in a world often clouded by cynicism. And yet he remained grounded, acknowledging the challenges ahead while still believing in the possibility of progress. As the segment progressed, Reeves shared a personal story that added another layer to the discussion. He spoke about a trip he had taken years ago to a remote village in South America. At the time, he had been searching for clarity during a difficult period in his life. "I wasn't looking for answers," he confessed. "I just wanted to get away from everything, to clear my head." During his stay, he had visited a small church tucked away in the hills. Inside, he found a community coming together in prayer and song. It wasn't about the building or the rituals, he recalled. It was about the people, the way they supported each other, the way they shared their joys and sorrows. Even though I didn't understand their language, I felt connected to them. It reminded me that faith isn't just about belief, it's about belonging. This reflection tied back to his earlier comments about Pope Robert Prevost. Both the pontiff and the villagers Reeves encountered embodied the same principle, the importance of fostering connections and creating spaces where people could come together. Whether through grand gestures or quiet acts of kindness, the goal was the same, to remind others that they weren't alone. By the time the second segment drew to a close, the impact of Reeves' words was undeniable. Viewers around the world found themselves reflecting on the themes he had raised: connection, compassion, and the enduring power of hope. Social media lit up with reactions as clips of the interview spread rapidly. Some praised Reeves for his eloquence, while others expressed gratitude for his willingness to tackle such profound topics. And yet, the best was still to come. As the cameras prepared to roll once more, anticipation hung in the air. What would Reeves say next? How much deeper would he go? For those watching, it was clear that this was no ordinary interview. It was a journey into the heart of what it meant to be human. And as the conversation continued, one thing became increasingly clear. Keanu Reeves wasn't just sharing his thoughts on Pope Robert Prevost. He was challenging everyone to think bigger, to care more, and to believe in the possibility of a better world. As the interview moved into its third segment, the atmosphere in the studio seemed to shift. The conversation had already touched on profound themes, but now it began to take on a more personal tone. The interviewer, sensing an opportunity to delve deeper, asked Keanu Reeves a question that caught him slightly off guard. "You've mentioned connection and compassion several times," she said. "But how do these ideas resonate with you personally? Have you ever experienced something that made you see the world, or yourself, differently?" Reeves sat back in his chair for a moment, his gaze drifting downward as if he were searching for the right words. Then, with a deep breath, he began to speak. "That's a good question," he said quietly, "and yes, I have." What followed was a rare glimpse into the actor's private life, a story he rarely shared publicly, but one that revealed a great deal about who he was as a person. He recounted a time when he had been struggling deeply. It was years ago, during a period marked by loss and uncertainty. Reeves had faced challenges that left him feeling adrift, questioning not just his purpose but also his place in the world. "I didn't know where to turn," he admitted. "I felt disconnected from everything, from myself, from others, from any sense of meaning." During this difficult chapter, he found himself drawn to places of worship, not because he was seeking answers, but because they offered a kind of solace he couldn't find elsewhere. "I started visiting churches, temples, mosques, anywhere that felt peaceful," he explained. "It wasn't about religion for me, it was about finding quiet, a space where I could breathe and think without judgment." One particular visit stood out in his memory. He described walking into a small chapel in Europe, its interior dimly lit by flickering candles. There were no grand decorations or elaborate ceremonies, just a simple, serene environment. As he sat there alone, he noticed other visitors coming and going. Some knelt in prayer, while others simply sat in silence, their faces reflecting a mix of emotions: sadness, gratitude, hope. "It hit me then," Reeves said, his voice softening. "We're all carrying something: pain, fear, longing. It doesn't matter what it is. What matters is that we're not alone in feeling it." That realization changed something in me. It reminded me that even when life feels overwhelming, there's always a thread connecting us to others, and sometimes all we need is to remember that. The room fell silent as Reeves paused, allowing his words to settle. His vulnerability was palpable, and it resonated deeply with those watching. For many viewers, his admission struck a chord. In a world that often celebrates strength and self-reliance, here was someone openly acknowledging moments of weakness and finding beauty in them. The interviewer, clearly moved, thanked him for sharing such a personal story. She then asked if he saw parallels between his experience and the message Pope Robert Prevost was trying to convey. Reeves nodded thoughtfully. "Absolutely," he replied. "Pope Robert talks a lot about compassion and understanding, but what stands out to me is how he emphasizes our shared humanity. He reminds us that no matter who we are or where we come from, we're all searching for meaning, for connection, for peace." He went on to explain how Prevost's approach mirrored what he had discovered in those quiet spaces of worship. "When you strip away titles, roles, and expectations, we're all just people trying to make sense of things," he said. "And I think that's what Pope Robert gets. He's not asking anyone to be perfect. He's saying, let's meet each other where we are." That's powerful. The discussion took another turn as the host brought up one of Prevost's recent initiatives, a global campaign encouraging acts of kindness. The Pope had urged Catholics, and indeed everyone, to perform small gestures of goodwill, whether it was helping a neighbor, volunteering at a shelter, or simply offering a listening ear. "Do you think these kinds of efforts can really make a difference?" she asked. Reeves smiled faintly, his expression thoughtful. "They might seem small, but they add up," he said. "Kindness is like a ripple in water. One act affects another, and before you know it, the impact spreads farther than you'd expect." He pointed to examples from his own life, recalling times when strangers had shown him unexpected kindness during tough periods. "It wasn't much. maybe a smile or a kind word, but it meant the world to me at the time. His perspective aligned perfectly with Prevost's vision. Both men believed in the transformative power of seemingly ordinary actions. Whether through grand gestures or everyday interactions, the goal was the same: to remind people that they mattered. What I admire most about Pope Robert, Reeves continued, is that he's not waiting for governments or institutions to lead the charge. He's telling individuals, you have the power to create change, and that's empowering. As the segment progressed, the conversation grew even more engaging. The interviewer posed a question that sparked lively discussion. Do you think celebrities should weigh in on spiritual or religious topics? Some critics argue that public figures shouldn't comment on matters of faith. Reeves listened carefully, then responded with characteristic humility. I understand the criticism, he said. Faith is deeply personal, and it's not something to be taken lightly. But at the same time, voices matter. If sharing my perspective encourages someone to reflect on their own beliefs or inspires them to treat others with more compassion, then I'll use my platform every time. He emphasized that his intention wasn't to preach or impose his views on anyone. Instead, he wanted to spark conversations and encourage people to think critically about their values. We live in a noisy world, he said. Sometimes it helps to pause and ask ourselves, what do I stand for? How am I contributing to the greater good? Those questions don't belong to any one group. They belong to all of us. By the time the third segment concluded, the audience was fully immersed in the dialogue. Social media buzzed with reactions as viewers praised Reeves for his honesty and insight. Many expressed how his reflections had prompted them to reconsider their own lives and relationships. Others shared stories of their own experiences with kindness, connection, or faith, inspired by the themes Reeves had explored. For those watching, it was clear that this wasn't just an interview. It was a moment of collective reflection. Through his words, Keanu Reeves had managed to bridge gaps between differing perspectives, inviting everyone to focus on what united them rather than what divided them. And as the cameras prepared to roll again, anticipation built. What would come next? Would Reeves continue to challenge conventional thinking? One thing was certain: this conversation was far from over. As the interview entered its fourth segment, the conversation began to take on a more philosophical tone. The host, sensing the depth of Keanu Reeves's reflections, decided to push further. You've talked about connection, compassion, and even personal struggles, she said. But let's zoom out for a moment. Do you think Pope Robert Prevost can truly bring change in such divisive times? Or is it too much to expect from one person? Reeves leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he took a moment to gather his thoughts, his fingers lightly tapping the armrest as if searching for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet conviction that drew everyone in. Change doesn't happen overnight, he said simply. It starts small, with acts of kindness, empathy, forgiveness, and maybe that's why people are drawn to him. He's not promising perfection, he's offering humanity. His response hung in the air, leaving both the interviewer and the audience to ponder its weight. Reeves wasn't dismissing the challenges ahead, rather he was reframing them. Change, he suggested, wasn't about grand declarations or sweeping reforms. It was about planting seeds of hope, understanding, and unity. And while one person alone couldn't transform the world, they could inspire others to join the effort. The interviewer nodded, clearly moved by his perspective. That's an interesting way to look at it, she said. But do you think people are ready to follow that path? After all, we're living in a time when division seems to be the norm. Reeves tilted his head slightly, considering her question. I think people are tired of division, he replied. They're tired of feeling isolated, of being pitted against each other. What Pope Robert is doing, calling for unity, for compassion, it resonates because it taps into something universal. It reminds us that we don't have to stay stuck in this cycle of anger and fear. He went on to explain how Prevost's message wasn't just about bridging divides between nations or religions. It was also about healing rifts within communities, families, and even individuals. "Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself," he said softly. And I think Pope Robert understands that. He's saying, let's start with love, not judgment. That's a powerful foundation. The discussion then shifted to the role of leadership in fostering change. The host asked Reeves if he believed leaders like Prevost had a responsibility to set an example. "Absolutely," he responded without hesitation. "Leadership isn't just about making decisions or giving orders. It's about showing people what's possible. When someone like Pope Robert steps up and says, 'We can do better,' it gives others permission to believe in that possibility too." Reeves pointed to moments in history where leaders had inspired collective action through their courage and vision. He mentioned figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, and Mother Teresa, people who had faced immense resistance but refused to give up on their dreams of a better world. "They weren't perfect," he said, "but they were relentless in their pursuit of good. And that's what matters. It's not about being flawless, it's about being committed." The analogy sparked a lively exchange between Reeves and the interviewer. She asked whether he thought Prevost's approach could withstand criticism or opposition. "Of course, there will be critics," he acknowledged. "There always are. But I think Pope Robert knows that. He's stepping into a role where scrutiny comes with the territory. What sets him apart is that he's not afraid to challenge traditions if it means moving toward greater compassion." Reeves paused, then added, "And honestly, that's what makes him relatable. He's not pretending to have all the answers. He's saying, let's figure this out together." That humility, it's rare, especially in positions of power, but it's exactly what we need right now. The conversation took another turn as the host brought up a sensitive topic: skepticism. Some critics had questioned whether Prevost's message of unity was realistic, given the complexities of modern society. Others wondered if his efforts would ultimately fall short. Reeves listened intently before responding, his tone measured, but firm. "I get the skepticism," he said. "The problems we face are huge: poverty, inequality, climate change. It's easy to feel overwhelmed. But here's the thing. Progress isn't linear. It's messy, and it takes time. What Pope Robert is doing isn't about solving everything overnight. It's about creating momentum, inspiring people to take the first step." He drew a parallel to his own life, recalling how small actions had often led to bigger outcomes. "When I first started acting, I didn't know where it would lead," he admitted. "All I could do was focus on the next scene, the next project, and over time those little steps added up. It's the same with change. You don't have to fix everything at once, just start somewhere." By this point, the audience was fully engaged. Social media buzzed with reactions as viewers shared clips of Reeves's insights and praised his wisdom. Many expressed how his words had encouraged them to think differently about their own capacity to make a difference. For some, it was a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could have a ripple effect. For others, it was an affirmation that hope was still worth holding on to. As the segment neared its end, the interviewer posed a final question. "If you could say one thing to Pope Robert Prevost, what would it be?" Reeves smiled faintly, his eyes softening. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for reminding us of our shared humanity, for showing us that love is stronger than fear, and for having the courage to lead with your heart." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. It was clear that Reeves wasn't speaking as a celebrity or public figure. He was speaking as a fellow human being, grateful for a message that transcended boundaries and touched the soul. His words resonated deeply, leaving the audience, and perhaps even the interviewer, momentarily speechless. When the cameras cut briefly to a commercial break, the impact of the conversation lingered. Viewers around the world found themselves reflecting on the themes Reeves had explored: the power of compassion, the importance of connection, and the enduring potential for change. For many, it was a reminder that even in the darkest times there was light to be found, if only we were willing to look for it. And as the interview prepared to move into its final segments, anticipation built. What more would Reeves share? How far would he go in challenging conventional thinking? One thing was certain: this was no ordinary conversation. It was a journey into the heart of what it meant to be human. A journey guided by the wisdom of someone who had spent a lifetime observing, learning, and growing. As the interview approached its final segment, the atmosphere in the studio seemed to grow quieter, as if everyone present, and even those watching at home, knew they were witnessing something special. The host glanced down at her notes briefly, before looking up at Keanu Reeves with a thoughtful expression. "We've talked about so much tonight," she began. "Faith, compassion, leadership, humility. But let me ask you this. What do you think is the most important lesson we can take from Pope Robert Prevost's message?" Reeves sat back slightly in his chair, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for the right way to express what he felt. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made every word feel deliberate. "I think the biggest lesson is this: we're stronger together than apart." The simplicity of his response struck a chord. It wasn't flashy or complicated. It was a truth so fundamental that it resonated deeply with everyone who heard it. Reeves went on to explain why this idea mattered so much. "We live in a world where division feels like the norm," he said. "People are pitted against each other, by politics, by religion, by fear. But what Pope Robert is reminding us is that none of those things define us completely. At our core, we're all human. And if we focus on that shared humanity, we can overcome anything." His words were met with nods of agreement from the audience. Many viewers at home found themselves pausing to reflect on how often they allowed differences to overshadow common ground. In a time when polarization dominated headlines, Reeves' reminder of unity felt like a balm, a gentle but powerful call to reconnect. The interviewer leaned forward slightly, her curiosity evident. "Do you think it's possible to bridge these divides? To really come together as one?" Reeves smiled faintly, his expression a mix of hope and realism. "It won't be easy," he admitted. "There will always be challenges, disagreements, moments of doubt. But I believe it's possible if we're willing to listen." Listening, he explained, was the key. Too often, people focused on being heard without taking the time to truly hear others. "Listening isn't just about hearing words," he said. "It's about understanding where someone is coming from, their pain, their fears, their hopes. When you listen like that, you start to see them not as an opponent, but as a person, and that changes everything." The discussion then turned to the role of forgiveness, not just toward others, but also toward ourselves. The host asked Reeves if he thought forgiveness was essential for healing divisions. His response was immediate and heartfelt. "Absolutely," he said. "Holding on to anger or resentment, it doesn't hurt the other person. It hurts you. Forgiveness isn't about excusing bad behavior. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of bitterness." He shared another personal insight, recalling a moment when he had struggled to forgive someone who had wronged him. "I held on to that anger for a long time," he confessed, "but eventually I realized it was only hurting me. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing peace over pain." This act of self-forgiveness, he added, was equally important. "We're often our own harshest critics," he said. "Learning to forgive yourself is one of the hardest but most liberating things you can do." As the conversation continued, the host posed a final, poignant question. "If there's one thing you want people to take away from this interview, what would it be?" Reeves paused, his gaze steady as he considered the question. Then, with a sincerity that left no doubt about his conviction, he responded, "That we're all connected, that your actions matter, even the small ones, and that hope is never wasted." His voice softened as he elaborated. "Hope isn't naive," he said. "It's brave. It's saying, I know things aren't perfect, but I believe they can get better. And sometimes that belief is enough to keep moving forward." He pointed to Pope Robert Prevost as an embodiment of this hope, a leader unafraid to dream of a better world and inspire others to join him in building it. When the interview concluded, the studio erupted into applause. Viewers around the globe were equally moved, flooding social media with messages of gratitude and admiration. Clips of Reeves's reflections spread rapidly, accompanied by comments, praising his wisdom, humility, and ability to articulate universal truths. For many, the interview had been more than just a conversation. It had been a catalyst for reflection and action. In the days that followed, the impact of Reeves's words continued to ripple outward. Inspired by his insights, some viewers began volunteering at local shelters or reaching out to estranged friends. Others committed to practicing active listening in their daily lives, striving to understand rather than judge. Even Pope Robert Prevost himself reportedly watched the interview, later expressing gratitude for Reeves's thoughtful reflections. What made this moment particularly remarkable was its universality. Regardless of religious beliefs or cultural backgrounds, people found value in Reeves's message. He hadn't preached or lectured. Instead, he had invited others to consider their own capacity for kindness, connection, and change. And in doing so, he reminded everyone of the enduring power of humanity. As the cameras cut off and the lights dimmed, Keanu Reeves stood up, shaking hands with the host and crew. There was no sense of grandeur in his demeanor, just quiet gratitude. For those who had tuned in, it was clear that this wasn't just an interview. It was a reminder of what it meant to be human, to strive for compassion, to embrace humility, and to believe in the possibility of a brighter future. And though the broadcast ended, its influence lingered. Conversations sparked by Reeves's words continued long after the credits rolled, inspiring countless individuals to take small but meaningful steps toward creating a more united and compassionate world. In a time of uncertainty and division, his reflections served as a beacon of hope, a gentle yet powerful affirmation that even in darkness light could still shine through.